Thanks to MPB for sponsoring this video. Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this video is all about the photo quality and features of the Fujifilm X-H2S, a high-end mirrorless camera designed for speed and costing $2,499 or pounds. If you're interested in the video capabilities, and you should be as they're really very good, then do check out my separate review all about them, and I've linked to that right here. Now, both of my photo and movie reviews were made with a final production X-H2S, and I'm going to dive straight into my results, as I've actually already covered the physical design and control system in my earlier hands-on video. So if you'd like a refresher on the look and the feel of the camera, do check that one out. Just before kicking off, a quick reminder that the X-H2S is one of two flagship bodies announced by Fujifilm in May 2022, both models debuting brand new sensors. The X-H2S is the first model to arrive, a specialist camera designed for speed with a 26 megapixel stacked sensor, while the second model, simply known as the X-H2, is designed for high resolution capture with a new 40 megapixel sensor, and that should be available towards the end of the year, and I don't know what the price of that model is yet. This video is all about the X-H2S, and in particular what its new stacked sensor will mean for you in practice. It is, after all, partly responsible for making the X-H2S one of the most expensive APS-C cameras today, so you really have to understand whether you really want or even need those capabilities. To find out, I've made a load of tests directly comparing it against the previous generation X-Trans4 sensor. Unfortunately, I was unable to source an X-T4 for this review, so instead I've opted for the X Pro 3 as it shares the same sensor, and that's what I really wanted to compare here. Sadly, Canon couldn't supply an EOS R7 in time for this particular video, but don't worry, I will be making some direct comparisons in a future one. Whichever camera you're thinking about buying, you can offset some of the cost by selling your old gear. I sell mine to MPB, so when they reached out about sponsoring one of my videos, I suggested talking about the process involved. MPB is the world's largest online platform for used photo and video kit, so if you have any gear taking up shelf space, head to MPB for an instant online quote. For example, at the time I made this video, MPB offered around £1,000 on an X-T4 in like new condition. MPB's service also includes free doorstep pickup, and once their team receives and confirms the condition of your gear, you can simply accept the quote and receive the money in your account the next day. No post office, hidden fees or disgruntled buyers to deal with. Alternatively, if your previous camera version is good enough for your needs, try searching MPB for a used model. I've bought some classic lenses at MPB, all in great condition. Buying and selling used kit extends its life and is good not just for your wallet, but also for the planet. I've always had a positive experience at MPB and can recommend them when you've got photo gear to buy, sell or trade. Check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Let's start with resolution. The X-H2S shares the same 26 megapixel resolution and X-Trans color filter array as the previous X-Trans4 generation, and it records compressed files in either JPEG or 10-bit HIF formats, or if you prefer, as 14-bit RAW files in compressed, lossless compressed or uncompressed versions. There's also the full 13 film simulations of the most recent bodies, as well as their grain, color chrome and monochrome effects. Now, I wasn't expecting any differences in practical resolving power compared to X-Trans4, but I do always like to do my tests just to make sure. So here's my standard resolution chart, photographed with the X-H2S using the XF 50-140 at 100mm f5.6. Taking a closer look with the X-H2S on the left and the X Pro 3 on the right, also sharing the same lens, shows them to be essentially resolving the same degree of detail, as indeed you'd expect. Comparing my result to previous tests shows the X-H2S and previous X-Trans4 models share a similar real-life resolving power to 24 megapixel APS-C sensors, like those in Sony's A6000 series. And while Canon's 32 megapixel sensor in the M6 II and the R7 has slightly greater potential for fine detail, it is extremely reliant on being paired with very sharp lenses to deliver any visible difference over 24 or 26 megapixel rivals, and that is something that future X-H2 owners with their 40 megapixel sensors will also have to take into account. Before moving on, I wanted to briefly mention an issue that I came across when testing my own X-H2S sample with the mechanical shutter. When shooting my resolution chart from a tripod with IBIS disabled at shutter speeds of around a 40th of a second, I noticed some motion blur when it was greatly magnified, and that suggests some degree of shutter shock taking place. Now, this could be eliminated by using faster or indeed slower shutter speeds in my tests, or by switching to the electronic shutter, or interestingly by enabling IBIS, which you wouldn't normally do when you've got a camera mounted on a tripod. Now, I've reported this to Fujifilm and will investigate further myself, but I just wanted to make a note. Moving on to noise, I photographed this bunch of flowers at every ISO setting using the XF 35mm f2 at f5.6, which in my previous tests has proven to be a very sharp lens. Like the previous generation, the X-Trans 5 sensor has a base sensitivity of 160 ISO, but also offers an extended low option down to 80 ISO. Like other low options though, don't assume that this will necessarily deliver superior quality to the base setting, and as I switch between the 80 and 160 ISO samples, notice how the pastel coloured petals on the 80 ISO version have become saturated, blowing out some of their colour. To be fair, most lower than base ISOs on other cameras also suffer from reduced dynamic range, but I did want to illustrate it here in case you were wondering. So for the best quality, always stick at the base sensitivity where possible, which for the X-H2S is 160 ISO. For comparison throughout the sensitivity range, here's a closer view of the flowers with the X-H2S on the left and the X Pro 3 on the right, representing X-Trans 4, both fitted with the same lens and using exactly the same settings. As before, the results look almost identical between both cameras. There's loads of fine detail up to around 800 ISO, with only fractional softening coming in at 1600 and 3200 ISO. Fine details then gradually become lost to noise and smoothing, with 12800 ISO and the extended high options of 25600 and 51200 ISO becoming visibly noisy. Next, for a quick look at dynamic range on the new sensor. Here, successfully lifting the shadows from the almost silhouetted tree trunks to reveal a decent degree of detail on the park. Like other cameras, you may notice a reduced dynamic range when using the electronic shutter, so if you're really into pulling the tonal range as much as possible, I would recommend shooting with the mechanical or electronic first curtain shutters instead. So my results so far show the X-H2S essentially delivering the same photo quality to the previous generation, proving that it's not going to be an upgrade in terms of pure resolution, noise levels, or indeed dynamic range. The benefits of the new model are instead concentrated on the speed of that stacked sensor, coupled with autofocusing upgrades in the new X Processor 5 and a faster card interface to reduce any bottlenecks. So let's start with a basic autofocus test recording the HDMI output from the X-H2S, first fitted with the XF 50-140 at 142.8, pulling focus between the bottles using a single AF area. It's looking pretty quick and confident here, and before moving on, here's the same test at closer range with the XF 23 1.4 wide open. That's the new model. As a side note, a respectful nod to this lens as it's one of Fujifilm's best in my opinion, and I'm going to show you a bunch of sample images taken with it on the X-H2S later, plus I've got a separate review if you're interested. But while the new X-Trans sensor and processor are more confident than previous generations when pulling focus in video, as I'll show you in my other review, where the combination really pulls ahead is when it comes to subject detection. A new subject detection menu lets you specifically choose between animals, birds, cars, bikes, aeroplanes and trains. There's also of course human face and eye detection enabled from a separate menu option which will override any previously selected subject from that other menu. This to me feels a little bit like the new subject menu has just been bolted on, as human should surely simply be added as an option to the single subject detection list. But it's not a big complaint, so here's the view from the X-H2S with face and eye detection enabled, showing it finding and tracking faces across the frame and switching to eye detection when the subject's a little bit closer or more easily identified. When the frame is full of people, you may need to give it some guidance, but on the whole it does a solid job. But you're here to see the other modes, right? So here's bird detection with one of Brighton's finest on my roof, recorded through a window, so please do forgive the quality here. Notice how it switches between framing the whole body of the bird to concentrate on the head where possible. It also works from a reasonable distance too, as you can see here, with the system successfully tracking the bird's head as I reposition it around the frame, while the camera successfully ignores the roof construction in the foreground. I didn't do anything clever here other than just point the camera at the bird. But static birds are easy, so hold on to your chips and donuts as I take the X-H2S and 5140 down to Brighton seafront to see how they handle seagulls in flight. Now it's a busy scene shooting over the front towards the pier, and there's often loads of birds to choose from, quite a challenging environment. Most of my AF footage and sample images here were taken with the lens at 142.8, using the electronic shutter at 20 frames per second, and with birds selected in the subject detection menu. You'll see the X-H2S sometimes frame a bird and start tracking it before briefly losing, then reacquiring it again during some of these sequences. Now, I photographed from the same position with Canon and Sony cameras fitted with similar focal ranges and found them to be a little bit stickier when actually tracking those seagulls. But despite briefly losing focus at times, the X-H2S still delivered loads of focused images at the high burst rates, while crucially the fast sensor readout meant that it reduced the skewing from rolling shutter, and that's the effect that plagues the electronic shutter modes on rival models that lack stacked sensors. For example, the Canon R5 and R6 Bird IAF may have been stickier in my own tests, but their pronounced skewing when you're using their electronic shutters meant that I really had to rely on their slower and louder mechanical shutters for subjects that really swung past at speed. The X-H2S also represents a big upgrade over Fujifilm's previous generation in both skewing and tracking, and I have many more examples coming right up. So next, the Goodwood Festival of Speed with the X-H2S, again fitted with a 50-140 zoom, but this time photographing BMX, mountain bikes and motorbikes using the bike option, of course, in the subject detection menu. Once again, I shot entirely with the electronic shutter and mostly at the 20 frames per second speed, as it delivered more than enough frames. From my shooting position, the bikes would enter the frame very quickly before then exiting behind another feature of the terrain just moments later. But you'll see the X-H2S framing them with an AF box almost instantly, zeroing in on the face as soon as it's detected. Subject tracking is of course only 50% of the equation, and crucially the X-H2S is also managing to drive the lens sufficiently quickly to grab a series of focused shots. In the live recording, the camera only has a couple of seconds, but at 20 frames per second that's enough for a large burst of images to choose from. Overall, my experience photographing the bikes at Goodwood with the X-H2S and 50-140 felt very positive for both stills and video, as you'll see in my other review, but there's faster targets at this festival. So I headed to the racetrack and selected cars from the subject detection menu. Like the bike option, the X-H2S will look out for a face first, even one wearing a helmet, but if none can be found on the frame, it'll detect the car itself, framing the nose, so that at least the grille and the lights should be in sharp focus. My first tests with cars were again with the 50-140, fully zoomed into 140mm and wide open at f2.8, often with the further 1.25 times crop applied for a little more reach, albeit at the cost of low resolution images. In my recordings of the AF tracking, you can see the system quickly identify and track the subject as it enters the frame and moves around, leaving you with little more to do than simply recomposing and shooting. Upon close inspection, my hit rate didn't quite attain 100%, but I still ended up with loads of sharp images to choose from, especially thanks to the fast burst speeds. In some of my bursts, I did notice the X-H2S wasn't completely immune to a little skewing due to rolling shutter if you were really swinging the camera from side to side when fitted with a telephoto lens, but again, it does represent a big improvement over non-stacked rivals, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But first, how about deploying the really big guns? I had a chance to try out the X-H2S at Goodwood with the recently launched XF 150-600mm Super Zoom, seen here in action at the long end where it's equivalent to 900mm. This inevitably makes it more of a challenge for aiming at fast action motorsports, but you can still see how the camera and lens are quickly identifying the subject as it enters the frame and allowing me to fire off a burst of images with a high number of keepers at 20 frames per second. I was also impressed with the sharpness of the 150-600 lens, very crisp right into the corners, wide open, and also sharper in those corners than the 100-400 when fitted with a 1.4 times converter in some brief comparisons that I was able to make. I think it's an important lens for the X-H2S as the combination is actually similar in price to the Canon R7 when fitted with the RF 100-500, with the full frame premium of that lens eroding the high cost of the Fujifilm body. So far, I mostly found myself shooting action with the X-H2S using its electronic shutter at 20 frames per second, simply because it delivered more than enough images with the kind of action that I was capturing. It's hard enough to go through thousands of images from an event shot at 20 frames per second without potentially doubling that. But the X-H2S will happily shoot at 30 or 40 frames per second with its electronic shutter if you really need it, and it can definitely be useful for very short bursts of very fast action, like say a bird taking flight or a splash of water. To demonstrate the potential, I have two sequences shot for you here at the top speeds of the X-H2S, starting with its mechanical shutter at 15 frames per second, and I confirmed that speed in separate tests. Here I've only captured one frame with the block shown in its entirety in the air and around 6 for the initial splash before that block bobs up again to the surface. Now for the same test but shot at 40 frames per second using the electronic shutter, and this time there's 3 frames showing the block in its entirety as it falls down and around 16 for that initial splash. Clearly this faster speed is very useful for bursts of very fast action, giving you many more frames to choose from for that perfect moment. Electronic shutters also have the benefit of operating in silence, which is great for quiet wildlife environments, but their overall usability can be greatly limited, first by slow sensor readout, which in turn causes skewing, not to mention the actual speed at which those large bursts of images can be cleared from the buffer. Now this is where the stack sensor and CF Express slot in the X-H2S come into play, both key benefits over the Canon R7, albeit also contributing to its high price. Let's start with some buffer tests, and to really tax the throughput I selected uncompressed RAW as the image type, and I also had the focus set to continuous throughout. In all of my tests I was also able to confirm the quoted shooting speeds, so my results that I'm about to share are mostly about the buffer size and the flush times. Starting with a 512GB SanDisk CF Express card, I shot 236, 161 or 142 uncompressed RAWs with the camera set to 20, 30 or 40 frames per second. At that point the camera slowed down to around 15 frames per second, and once I let go of the shutter, the buffer would take about 10 seconds to fully write onto the card. So you're looking at capturing about 10 seconds worth of action at 20 frames per second, or about 3.5 seconds worth at 40 frames per second before that speed slows down. Switching to SD memory with a Lexar Professional card, I shot 112, 113 or 102 uncompressed RAWs with the camera set to 20, 30 or 40 frames per second, and at that point it slowed much more, down to around 5 frames per second, and took far longer to flush the buffer, typically 45 to 60 seconds. So the X-H2S can deliver very usable bursts with fast SD cards, but if you can stretch to CF Express you'll squeeze more images into that initial burst, you'll suffer from less speed throttling once the buffer's full, and crucially you'll free up the entire buffer much faster. Oh, and if you're shooting JPEGs or anything using the slower mechanical shutter at 15 frames per second, you can pretty much keep on shooting in most of the modes until you run out of memory with either card type. As for skewing, here's 2 sequences of cars that I photographed at Goodwood with the X-H2S fitted with a 50-140 zoom and using its 20 frames per second electronic shutter. Now I was panning pretty quickly from left to right here as they drove past, and there's certainly some evidence of minor skewing at the moments of greatest motion. All the cameras with stacked sensors I've tested, from the OM1 to the Alpha 1, have been faster than their non-stacked counterparts, but none of them completely eliminate that rolling shutter effect. Instead, they reduce it, so the question is whether that reduction is enough to make the electronic shutter usable for your particular subjects. I'd personally say that while the X-H2S, like other stacked models, clearly isn't immune from the rolling shutter effect, it visibly only cropped up at times when I really wouldn't have used those images anyway. It certainly didn't affect my shots with milder panning speeds of cars or birds, and those were at times when it certainly was visible on similar shots taken with non-stacked rivals. To illustrate the step up over X-Trans 4 models like the X-T4, here's a sequence shot with the X-H2S and 20 frames per second electronic shutter, panning quickly over the rear of a house. Notice how the verticals are slanting a little bit in this example. But now here's the same test with the X Pro 3 representing X-Trans 4 models, showing far greater skewing. So while both models do exhibit the skewing effect on fast pans, the X-H2S suffers to a much milder degree and may in fact be essentially invisible in many situations. Your mileage will of course vary, but the bottom line is I found skewing from the electronic shutter on the X-T3 and X-T4, not to mention the Canon EOS R5 and R6 pretty much ruled them out for fast pans when using the electronic shutter, instead forcing me to rely on their slower and more audible mechanical shutters instead. In contrast, the stacked sensor in the X-H2S, along with the OM1, EOS R3, Alpha 9 and Alpha 1, all made their electronic shutter options much more practical for shooting fast action. Not immune, but much better. And just before my final verdict, a quick look at stabilization with the view through the X-H2S fitted with the XF 35mm f2. First with IBIS disabled, where it's obviously very wobbly, before switching it on in the menus and returning to a much steadier view. Stabilization of course allows you to handhold slower shutters than without, but for me it's equally useful for stabilizing the view as you compose, especially when using longer lenses that might lack optical stabilization of their own. Okay, now it's finally time for my verdict, during which I'll show you a bunch of images that I took with a final production X-H2S fitted with a variety of lenses, ranging from the XF 10-24 all the way up to the XF 150-600. As always, you can access the original images for a closer look via my review at cameralabs.com. Note, the following concentrates on using the X-H2S for stills photography. The X-H2S is Fujifilm's most assured camera for action, sports and wildlife photography to date, inheriting the photo quality of the previous generation, but crucially delivering it in a much faster and more confident body. While I personally miss the vintage aesthetic of earlier models, I've got no complaints with the controls from a purely functional perspective, and the camera feels great in your hands. The viewfinder delivers a large and detailed image with fast refresh rates for smoothly following the action, and the fully articulated screen allows you to comfortably compose at high or low positions in the landscape or portrait orientation. The photo quality may be essentially the same as X-Trans 4 models, but that stacked sensor reduces the skewing effect from rolling shutter. This in turn makes the high-speed burst modes more practical than previous models. The CF Express slot also reduces a bottleneck, allowing longer bursts and much faster flushing of the buffer to shoot again. Although if you're recording to both card slots simultaneously, the SD one could potentially slow you down. The autofocus system also represents a big upgrade over previous generations, with effective recognition and tracking for a variety of subjects. Although I think it would have made more sense if human face and eye detection was integrated in the same menu with the other subjects. In my test with birds, I found Canon and Sony's tracking to be a little stickier, but the X-H2S still comfortably outperforms its predecessors and delivered a large number of keepers at high burst speeds in my tests. The stacked sensor, high-res viewfinder and CF Express slot all add to the cost though, making the X-H2S one of the priciest APS-C cameras to date. To be fair, other stacked sensor cameras aren't exactly cheap either. The Olympus OM1 undercuts it slightly, albeit employing a smaller 4/3 sensor, while stacked full framers like Sony's A9 II costs almost double. So you have to ask yourself very honestly if you're really going to exploit the benefits of that sensor, and a lot of it boils down to how much you really need the top speed and silence of an electronic burst, crucially coupled with minimal skewing, even with quick action. Maybe your subject wouldn't trigger skewing on a camera with a slower sensor. Or maybe a mechanical shutter would be fast enough for your needs. Like many flagship bodies, the X-H2S is an unapologetically specialist camera that will only be justified by a small number of photographers, so don't buy it unless you're one of them. If you love Fujifilm's images and lenses but won't exploit the stacked sensor, why not consider an X-T4 instead, or perhaps the upcoming X-H2 version? That said, it is important to compare the cost of a simple wildlife setup with a single big lens. Canon's EOS R7 may significantly undercut the body price of the X-H2S, but if you are thinking of equipping it with a new RF 100-500 zoom, you could alternatively buy an X-H2S with the XF 150-600 for much the same money, and that would give you the benefits of a stacked sensor, a high-resolution viewfinder, and a compact flash express slot. Sure, the RF lens is corrected for full-frame bodies, but plenty of birders will be fitting it on the EOS R7 in the absence of an L-class telephoto zoom designed for APS-C, something, lest we forget, Canon never made for its range of EFS DSLRs. The moral, of course, being not only to think very carefully about which body features you really need, but the system cost as a whole when you factor in the lenses that you desire. I look forward to making some direct comparisons between the X-H2S and EOS R7 in a future video. And that's the end of my review of the X-H2S aimed at photographers. If you're interested in the movie capabilities of this camera, do check out my other video, as it's really very good in that regard. If you find any of this useful, I'd love it if you considered following my channel, and as always, if you're feeling extra generous or fancy treating yourself, there's links in the description to buy me a coffee or to treat yourself to some Cameralabs merchandise, as well as checking the latest pricing on the X-H2S. And thanks again to MPB for sponsoring this video. If you've got any photo gear to buy, sell or trade, check them out at mpb.com or using the links in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.